The pin measured 4 inches long. Bridge inspectors had photographed it during routine checks. They documented the corrosion. They noted the rust. They filed their reports. Nobody replaced it. On June 28, 1983, at 3:07 in the morning, that 4-inch rusted pin gave way and 100 feet of Interstate 95 collapsed into the Mianus River below. 3 drivers never saw it coming. The night was hot. Oppressively hot. The kind of Connecticut summer heat that makes sleep impossible and keeps people reading on their boats at 1:30 in the morning. Werner Albrecht was on his yacht docked at the Cos Cob Marina, reading by lamplight. He'd been thinking he should really get to sleep when he heard it. A very deep roar. A thump like a bass drum. The screech of tires. He looked up and saw headlights cascading down off the Mianus Bridge. Sets of them. Dropping through the darkness like falling stars. 100 feet above the river, Margot Cardozo's house shook. She'd been unable to sleep, sitting in her kitchen with milk and chocolate chip cookies. At 1:30 exactly, a noise like an explosion rattled the windows. She thought maybe a truck had jackknifed on the bridge overhead. She had no idea the bridge itself was gone. Meanwhile, just upstream, David Pace was driving a tractor-trailer northbound on I-95. His wife Helen sat beside him in the cab, sleeping. They were hauling pot roasts from Georgia to New England. The massive truck rolled across the bridge at 55 miles per hour. Then there was nothing under the wheels. David would later recall those seconds in testimony that still chills engineers today. Quote, "There was nothing under the truck and that was it. All this happened so quick. I was on the bridge when it collapsed. I heard crack, like a bolt of lightning." End quote. The truck fell 70 feet straight down. 7 stories. Into the Mianus River at high tide. What happened next would expose a failure that went far beyond 2 corroded pins. It would reveal a systemic breakdown in how Connecticut maintained 3,425 bridges with just 12 engineers. Working in pairs. Assigned 400 bridges each per year. This is the story of how institutional neglect transforms routine maintenance into mass casualty events. How warnings ignored become catastrophes vindicated. And how a 4-inch piece of rusted steel killed 3 people because nobody bothered to replace it. Let's go back to 1958. The Mianus River Bridge opened for traffic as part of the Connecticut Turnpike, carrying Interstate 95 over the Mianus River between Cos Cob and Riverside. The bridge used a pin and hanger design, popular in the 1950s but fundamentally flawed in ways engineers wouldn't fully understand for another quarter century. The design was elegant in theory. Steel pins, each about 4 inches in diameter, connected massive girders that supported the bridge deck. Hangers suspended from these pins held the weight of the roadway. The system allowed for expansion and contraction as temperatures changed. But it had a fatal weakness. The design was fracture critical. Non-redundant. If a single pin failed, there was no backup system. The entire span would collapse. And the pins were nearly impossible to inspect properly. They sat inside assemblies covered with grease and road grime. Inspectors would have to dismantle parts of the structure just to see them clearly. Visual checks from ladders or platforms could only spot the most obvious problems. The pins were also vulnerable to a very specific type of failure. Water infiltration. Salt from de-icing chemicals. Corrosion that worked from the inside out. In 1973, 10 years before the collapse, Connecticut highway crews performed routine road maintenance on the bridge. They deliberately blocked the storm drains on the deck. Standard procedure during resurfacing work. When they finished the job, they forgot to unblock them. For the next 10 years, rainwater, melted snow, and road salt had nowhere to go. The water pooled on the bridge deck, then seeped down through tiny cracks in the asphalt. It dripped directly onto the pin and hanger assemblies below. Drip, drip, drip. Every rainstorm, every snowmelt, every winter morning when salt trucks spread chemicals to melt ice. The water carried dissolved salts down into the bearing assemblies. The pins began to rust. Not surface rust that inspectors might spot. Deep corrosion that worked its way through the steel from inside the bearing surfaces. By 1980, stress corrosion cracks had formed in the pin at the southeast corner of the suspended span. By 1982, those cracks had propagated nearly halfway through the pin's diameter. And nobody knew. In September of 1982, 9 months before the collapse, Connecticut Department of Transportation sent 2 inspectors to examine the Mianus River Bridge. They spent 3 days on the structure, from September 16 through 18. They performed a visual safety inspection. They looked at the bridge from below, from the sides, from access platforms. They took notes. They photographed certain elements. They rated the bridge's condition as satisfactory. No noted deficiencies in the hanger assembly. 9 months later, that hanger assembly would fail catastrophically. But there's something worse. After the collapse, investigators discovered that one of the inspectors had altered his notes. He'd added 20 additional observations to his report. He made them look like they'd been written during the original inspection. As if he'd noticed problems that needed attention. He was caught because he used a finer pencil. The different graphite density was visible under examination. He'd tried to cover his failure by fabricating a more thorough inspection after 3 people were dead. The inspector had a long record of good service. Decades of work. So instead of being fired, he received 1-year probation. But his falsified notes revealed something more disturbing than one man's panic. They showed that Connecticut's bridge inspection program was fundamentally broken. At the time of the disaster, the state had exactly 12 engineers assigned to bridge safety inspection. They worked in pairs. 6 teams. Responsible for 3,425 highway bridges and another 1,200 bridges on local roads. Each 2-person team was assigned 400 bridges per year. Do the math. That's nearly 2 bridges every single working day. Complete inspections. Detailed documentation. Identification of problems. Recommendations for repairs. It was impossible. Internal inquiries later found that some inspectors had cut corners just to stay on schedule. Some had even claimed to perform inspections they hadn't actually done. The system was designed to fail. And in the weeks before June 28, 1983, the Mianus River Bridge was trying very hard to warn everyone it was about to fail. Residents who lived near the bridge began noticing strange sounds. Unusual vibrations. Gordon Gilman lived in Riverside, close enough to hear traffic on I-95. In March of 1983, he called the state maintenance department. So did his neighbors. Quote, "We told them the bridge was noisy, vibrating and dangerous." End quote. On the weekend immediately before the collapse, the sounds got worse. Multiple residents reported an increase in strange noises and vibrations. One resident described it as being, quote, "like thousands of birds chirping." End quote. The bridge was literally crying out. The corroded pin was flexing under load. Microscopic movements in the failing metal. Stress waves propagating through the structure. The sounds of steel dying. No action was taken. No emergency inspection. No traffic restrictions. Nothing. If you're enjoying this documentary on engineering failures and institutional negligence, consider subscribing to Built to Fail for more stories about disasters that could have been prevented. The bridge carried its warning sounds through the hot night of June 27 and into the early hours of June 28. 80,000 to 90,000 vehicles crossed it daily. One of the busiest stretches of highway in the United States. At 1:30 a.m., traffic was light. Maybe 100 vehicles per hour instead of the thousands that would traverse the span during rush hour. The pin was hanging on by less than 30% of its original cross-section. The rest had corroded away or cracked through. David and Helen Pace's truck, loaded with frozen pot roasts, weighed approximately 40,000 pounds. Add the weight of the tractor and you're looking at 70,000 pounds rolling across the bridge deck. That extra weight, at that exact moment, was enough. The pin failed. Not gradually. Not with warning. It simply snapped. The hanger assembly on the southeast corner of the suspended span had nothing holding it anymore. The massive steel girder, weighing hundreds of tons, dropped. The sudden shift in load caused the northwest corner assembly to fail within milliseconds. 100 feet of Interstate 95 deck, 3 full lanes wide, fell into the river in less than 2 seconds. David Pace's truck went with it. So did a second tractor-trailer hauling beer bottles and cans. So did 2 passenger cars. Werner Albrecht, reading on his boat, grabbed his flashlight and rushed to the dock. Quote, "I found a truck in the water with a couple on top of their cab calling for help." End quote. David Pace had somehow survived the 70-foot fall. The truck had hit the water nose first, the cab smashing into the river at terminal velocity. The impact should have killed them both. Helen Pace was badly injured but conscious. David had broken ribs and internal injuries but was able to climb onto the roof of the submerged cab. They were screaming for help in the darkness. A woman was trapped in one of the passenger cars. Eileen Weldon of Darien, pinned inside the twisted wreckage. People on boats could hear her crying out. The smell of diesel fuel was overwhelming. Hundreds of gallons had spilled from the trucks. The fear of fire was immediate and real. Werner Albrecht wasn't the only person responding. Other boat owners who'd been working late or sleeping on their vessels grabbed life preservers and flashlights. They couldn't get close because of the debris field, so they jumped into the water and swam. Meanwhile, someone had called 911. Greenwich Police Dispatch received the first call at 1:34 a.m. The caller said a car had possibly gone over the Mianus Bridge wall. Nobody understood yet that the bridge itself was gone. Firefighter Larry Flynn heard the call on his radio scanner at home. He jumped in his personal vehicle and took I-95 northbound toward the bridge. He got stuck in traffic. Another firefighter, Rick Shuttleworth, took River Road instead. When he reached a position where he could see the bridge, his voice came over the radio microphone. Other emergency responders would later recall his exact words. Quote, "Holy Christmas, the bridge fell." End quote. Firefighters Michael O'Connor and Ben McGorty were the first official responders to reach the scene. They arrived to find chaos in the darkness. Traffic was still flowing on the southbound lanes, completely unaware that the northbound side had vanished. Cars were approaching the gap at highway speed. O'Connor and McGorty had to stop traffic before more vehicles plunged into the void. Chet West was the dispatcher on duty at Greenwich Fire Department Central Headquarters. He'd been reading Guns of August when he heard the police scanner request for units to look for a car that had possibly gone over the bridge wall. His phone started ringing. Firefighters who'd heard their radio scanners. Calling to ask what was happening. Offering to respond. By 1:40, the magnitude of the disaster was becoming clear. Greenwich Police, Connecticut State Police, Greenwich Fire Department, the town's Marine Police, and the United States Coast Guard were all responding. Sergeant Jeffrey Moran arrived with his brother, also with the police department, and Officer Nick Maculasso. They got to the marina on River Road and found a fisherman just coming in on his boat. They commandeered the vessel. But the debris field was too thick. Chunks of concrete, twisted steel, vehicle parts, and cargo from the trucks floating everywhere in the darkness. They couldn't navigate close enough to help. Quote, "There was just so much debris in the water we couldn't get any closer, so we put on life preservers and swam to get closer." End quote, Moran recalled decades later. They couldn't take flashlights into the water. Their eyes had to adjust to the dim light. The water was full of beef. One of the trucks had been hauling chunks of pot roast. The paste truck. The cargo had spilled across the river. Quote, "One of the trucks was carrying chunks of beef. When we bumped into them we didn't know whether they were bodies." End quote. They kept pulling up hunks of meat. State Trooper Tom Brown, a certified diver, arrived with the dive team. He later described the conditions. Quote, "You couldn't see into the water, and as you reach underneath you don't know if you have a body or a side of beef. And we kept pulling up hunks of beef. Fortunately it was beef." End quote. The other truck had been carrying beer. Bottles and cans. Thousands of them. Floating in the current, sinking, washing downstream. Brad Schlegel, a volunteer with the Cos Cob Ambulance Corps, arrived to help with casualties. He would later tell reporters, quote, "It was scary as all hell. It was spooky, you really couldn't see what you had." End quote. Rescuers pulled David and Helen Pace from the top of their submerged truck cab. They found 2 other survivors in critical condition. But 3 people were dead. 3 people who'd been driving home from work or traveling for business. People who had no way of knowing that the bridge they'd crossed 1,000 times was about to disappear beneath them. Susan Shannon, another witness, managed to stop her car before reaching the gap. She could hear water splashing below. She got her flashlight and shone it down into the darkness. Quote, "I could hear people calling for help. I saw blood. I saw a boat and someone already trying to help people. I heard people trying to reassure a badly injured woman who was pinned inside her car, telling her help was on the way." End quote. That woman was Eileen Weldon. Trapped in twisted metal. Rescuers working desperately to free her while diesel fuel vapors filled the air and everyone feared a single spark could turn the river into an inferno. Resident Gordon Gilman, who'd called authorities about the bridge vibrations back in March, was one of the first civilians on scene. He told reporters from the Advocate newspaper, quote, "I heard what sounded like an explosion. I called 911 immediately and told them the bridge had collapsed and to come to the end of Buxton Landing. The police and rescue truck responded very quickly, within a few minutes." End quote. By 3 a.m., the rescue operation was in full swing. Spotlights illuminated the disaster. The scale of the collapse became visible. A 100-foot section of 3-lane highway simply gone. The suspended span had fallen 70 feet into the river, taking 4 vehicles with it. News crews arrived. Cameras captured the twisted wreckage. By dawn, the images would be broadcast across the nation. News 12 Connecticut reporter Becky Surran, who'd started at the station just a year earlier, arrived at the scene. She would later recall, quote, "I was like, this is something out of a movie. I see a gaping hole in the Mianus River bridge and I thought we have a national story." End quote. Susan Berger Sabrine, the first news director for News 12 Connecticut, would remember, quote, It was pretty exciting and overwhelming both at the same time. You just felt like, wow, how could that ever happen? End quote. By morning, the full horror was visible in daylight. The northbound span simply ended in jagged steel. Below, in the river, mangled vehicles rested in shallow water. Recovery crews worked to extract bodies and begin the investigation. Connecticut Governor William O'Neill arrived to view the damage. He met with press at the site. The images show him looking out over the collapsed span, visibly shaken. The preliminary investigation began immediately. Divers searched the riverbed. They were looking for one specific component: the pin. They found it. A 4-inch diameter steel cylinder. Heavily corroded. Cracked nearly through. The physical evidence was damning. But the real investigation would take months. The National Transportation Safety Board assembled a team and arrived the day after the collapse. They immediately recognized parallels to earlier disasters. The Point Pleasant Bridge in West Virginia had collapsed in 1967, killing 46 people. That disaster had led to nationwide bridge inspection standards. 16 years later, those standards had failed to prevent the Mianus collapse. What had gone wrong? The NTSB investigation would eventually deliver a 70-page preliminary report and a comprehensive final report that fundamentally changed how America approaches bridge safety. But first, they had to understand exactly how the pin failed. Metallurgical analysis revealed that the pin had suffered stress-corrosion cracking. Water laden with dissolved road salt had infiltrated the bearing assembly. The salt created an electrochemical environment that accelerated corrosion. The pin hadn't just rusted on the surface. It had corroded from the inside out. Microscopic cracks had formed and propagated through the steel for years. By the time of the collapse, the pin had lost more than 70% of its load-bearing capacity. Engineers analyzing the failure couldn't believe it had held as long as it did. But why hadn't inspectors caught it? The NTSB investigators interviewed the Connecticut DOT inspectors who'd examined the bridge in September 1982. The testimony was revealing. The inspectors had performed visual examinations. They'd looked at the bridge from various angles. They'd noted some minor issues, routine maintenance items. But they hadn't cleaned the grease and grime from the pin and hanger assemblies. They hadn't used specialized equipment to detect subsurface cracks. They hadn't performed hands-on probing of critical components. They'd essentially looked at the bridge from a distance and called it good. Why? Because Connecticut's bridge inspection manual didn't require anything more. The state had adopted federal national bridge inspection standards in 1971, after the Silver Bridge disaster. But those standards focused on routine visual checks. They didn't mandate specialized inspections of fracture-critical components. They didn't require dismantling assemblies to check hidden surfaces. They didn't demand the kind of intensive, time-consuming work needed to actually verify the condition of pins buried inside bearing assemblies. And Connecticut's inspectors, already overwhelmed with 400 bridges per team per year, had no time for anything beyond the minimum required. The NTSB investigators also discovered the blocked storm drains. When crews had paved over the drains in 1973, they'd created the perfect conditions for accelerated corrosion. Water pooling on the deck, seeping down onto the pins, providing constant moisture for 10 years. Nobody had noticed. Nobody had unblocked the drains. The maintenance records showed the oversight had never been corrected. The INTSB's final conclusion was damning. Quote, The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the collapse of the Mianus River bridge span was the undetected lateral displacement of the hangers of the pin and hanger suspension assembly in the southeast corner of the span by corrosion-induced forces due to deficiencies in the state of Connecticut's bridge safety inspection and bridge maintenance program. End quote. Deficiencies in the state's program. Not a freak accident. Not an unpredictable failure. A preventable collapse caused by inadequate inspection and maintenance. The residents who'd complained about strange noises had been right. The bridge was dangerous. Gordon Gilman's March phone call had been prescient. Quote, "I called the maintenance people in March and so did my neighbors. We told them the bridge was noisy, vibrating and dangerous." End quote. Nobody had listened. Federal investigators also pointed fingers at the Federal Highway Administration. The WA was supposed to audit state inspection programs to ensure compliance with national standards. But those audits were reactive, not proactive. The FHWA had allowed Connecticut's understaffed, overwhelmed inspection program to continue operating without intervention. The NTSB noted that the bridge had been classified as structurally deficient in federal inventories before the collapse. That classification hadn't triggered any enhanced inspection requirements. The system had failed at every level. State, federal, design, maintenance, inspection. 3 people paid with their lives. The victims' families filed lawsuits. The state eventually reached settlements totaling over $6 million with 4 of the 6 victims. David and Helen Pace, the truck drivers who survived by clinging to their cab in the river, filed suit separately. Their case highlighted the ongoing physical and psychological trauma. The state's insurance covered only $1 million. Connecticut taxpayers paid the rest. Deputy Attorney General Clarine Nardi-Riddle announced the state would try to recover costs from Tippett's Abbott McCarthy Stratton, the New York engineering firm that had designed the original bridge. The political fallout was significant. Governor O'Neill faced intense criticism for the state's failure to maintain infrastructure. The disaster contributed to his loss in the 1986 Democratic primary. But O'Neill also responded decisively. He proposed a $5.5 billion transportation spending package. Money for bridge rehabilitation and replacement across Connecticut. The state legislature approved emergency funding. Within a year, Connecticut DOT had hired dozens of additional bridge inspectors. They purchased new inspection equipment. They completely overhauled training programs. The bridge design process was changed to include more inspector feedback. New bridges would be required to have redundant load paths. If one component failed, others could carry the load. The pin and hanger design was effectively banned from future construction. Connecticut also began a massive retrofit program. Similar bridges across the state were reinforced or replaced. But the immediate problem was traffic. 80,000 to 90,000 vehicles crossed the Mianus River Bridge daily, one of the busiest highway corridors in the northeastern United States. With the northbound span gone, all that traffic had to go somewhere. It got diverted onto Route 1 and local streets in Greenwich. The summer of 1983 was a nightmare for local residents. Tens of thousands of vehicles poured through their neighborhoods. Traffic jams lasted for hours. Commercial trucks, normally on the highway, rumbled through residential areas. Emergency crews worked around the clock to design and install a temporary fix. In July, barely a month after the collapse, a temporary truss was installed. The highway reopened to light vehicle traffic. But buses and heavy trucks still had to use Route 1. It wasn't until September that a stronger truss could handle full traffic loads. The permanent replacement wouldn't be completed until 1992, 9 years after the collapse. The new bridge eliminated pin and hanger assemblies entirely. The design included full redundancy, multiple load paths, fail-safe systems. The new bridge also featured full shoulders on both sides, absent from the original. Improved drainage to prevent water infiltration. Better access for inspection. It was officially named the Michael L. Marano Bridge, after a state senator who represented Greenwich. But most people still call it the Mianus River Bridge. The lessons from the disaster rippled across the nation. Federal bridge inspection standards were overhauled. New requirements mandated specialized inspections of fracture-critical components. States were required to have adequate inspection staff. Training standards were raised. Equipment requirements were specified. Bridge design standards were changed to require redundancy. Single-point failures were no longer acceptable. The disaster also changed how engineers thought about aging infrastructure. Bridges don't last forever. Designs that seemed adequate in the 1950s might not handle modern traffic loads. Inspection isn't just about looking at a structure. It's about understanding failure modes and checking the invisible problems. Decades later, the Mianus River Bridge collapse remains a cautionary tale. When the I-35W bridge in Minneapolis collapsed in 2007, killing 13 people, investigators immediately thought of Mianus. Both were aging bridges that had been inspected and rated adequate. Both featured designs with limited redundancy. When the I-85 bridge in Atlanta collapsed in 2017 after a fire, transportation officials pointed to Mianus as a reminder of infrastructure vulnerability. When the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore was struck and collapsed in 2024, the immediate response showed how much had changed since Mianus. Emergency protocols, inspection requirements, rapid response capabilities. But the fundamental lesson remains the same. Deferred maintenance kills. Inadequate inspection programs kill. Ignoring warning signs kills. 4-inch pins seemed insignificant. Just small components in a massive structure. Easy to overlook. Easy to defer replacing. Until they fail. First Selectman Fred Camillo, speaking on the 40th anniversary of the disaster, summed it up. Quote, "You're driving along and you have no idea what's underneath you and what condition it's in. Any lessons to be learned are always to fund and maintain the routine maintenance checks. That is critical. You can never ever skip on that." End quote. Former state senator Tony Boucher recalled using the bridge twice a week with her 3 young children in the back seat. When she heard about bridge collapses in other states, she said it absolutely reminded her of Mianus. Quote, "You imagine yourself in one of those horror movies where the car is dangling off of a bridge. A lot of those action movies and so forth." End quote. But this wasn't a movie. This was Interstate 95. A hot June night. A routine drive home. David Pace would never forget hearing that crack like lightning. Werner Albrecht would never forget seeing those headlights cascade down. Brad Schlegel would never forget the darkness and not knowing if what he was pulling from the river was human or cargo. The families of the victims would never forget getting the call that their loved one wasn't coming home. All because a 4-inch pin that should have been replaced years ago finally gave way. Connecticut's response, at least, was appropriate to the scale of the tragedy. The state invested billions in bridge rehabilitation. Inspection programs were completely rebuilt. By 1997, the percentage of Connecticut bridges classified as structurally deficient or functionally obsolete had dropped from over 60% to just over 28%. progress. But as the NTSB and transportation advocates continually warn, the lesson of Mianus is one nobody wants to relearn. America has over 600,000 bridges. Many of them are aging. Many were designed for traffic loads far lighter than what they now carry. Many use designs that would no longer be approved. Inspecting them properly costs money. Maintaining them costs money. Replacing them costs money. It's always tempting to defer that spending. To put it off another year. To focus budget resources on new projects instead of boring maintenance. Until a bridge collapses. The Mianus River Bridge stood for 25 years. It carried millions of vehicles. It served its purpose faithfully. Until it didn't. 3 people died. 3 others suffered critical injuries that affected them for the rest of their lives. Hundreds of thousands of people had their daily commutes disrupted for months. The state paid millions in settlements and billions in infrastructure repairs. All of it preventable. All of it predicted by the residents who heard the bridge crying out in its final days. All of it documented in inspection photographs that showed rust near the bearing assemblies, if anyone had bothered to look closely. All of it waiting to happen because 12 engineers couldn't possibly inspect 3,425 bridges properly. The pin measured 4 inches long. And when it snapped, it took 3 lives with it. If this video has shown you how small failures cascade into catastrophic disasters, make sure you're subscribed to Built to Fail. We cover the engineering failures and institutional negligence that shape how we build safer infrastructure today. The Mianus River Bridge collapse remains one of America's most significant bridge disasters. Not because of the death toll, which was mercifully small compared to what it could have been, but because of what it revealed about American infrastructure. About deferred maintenance. About inadequate inspection. About the cost of looking the other way. Today, when you drive over a bridge, you're trusting that someone inspected it properly. That corrosion was detected and repaired. That cracks were found and fixed. That warning signs were heeded. Most of the time, that trust is warranted. But only because disasters like Mianus forced changes to the system. Only because 3 people died on a hot June night in 1983. Only because a 4-inch pin finally failed after years of trying to warn anyone who would listen. The bridge is still there. Rebuilt. Modernized. Safe. But the lesson remains. Infrastructure isn't permanent. Inspection isn't optional. Maintenance can't be deferred indefinitely. And when residents complain about strange noises and vibrations, someone needs to listen. Before the bridge falls down.